feel like I need to explain that I bought pizza for 80 because I was doing the math. Like, what if a guy and his friend eats a whole pizza? That probably won't happen. What if a guy and his friend eat a third of a pizza? So that's the kind of situation I set this up for. So you saw the flyers. I'll let us introduce ourselves, and we'll kind of kick off with just a discussion. So plan is, let's say 45 minutes of talking. Feel free to chime in. I want this to be informal. I want this to be more relational. And then we'll save the last 15 minutes for questions, unless you'll kind of pepper us in the middle. I'm totally cool with that. So, Dave, we'll start at the end with you, and then we'll go back to you.
All right. David Hill. I'm the chair of the Landscape Architecture Program, so under APLA. I see a couple of APLA folks. Look forward to meeting the other folks that I don't know your faces. That's it.
Yeah.
I can't think of anything else that we should add.
A simple man.
Can you?
No. I'm Kelly Bryan, I'm graphic design.
Wait, and your most embarrassing moment.
No.
Go
you
ahead.
do-
No, it's not.
Right now.
Does this count?
I'm Anna Ruth Gatlin, interior design. And none of my students are here.
Jennifer Smith, I'm a visiting assistant professor in environmental design.
Matt Hall in architecture. I have to work with that guy in the end. And Henry's here. So that's really all that matters.
Is there a reason why y'all are on opposite ends?
Maybe we have to work.
Keep them separated. I've been working in industrial design, and I literally thought Matt Hall was like 5'10", and so like I just thought you were shorter.
They got our physical stats on the website.
Maybe we should upload them.
6'3", bow-legged, bad hip.
I know that guy. I saw him across campus. There's a certain gait. It's kind of like a swagger to that person. Let's rebrand that.
I can't believe you've seen me walking. I don't get out of the building too much. Must have been that one time.
That one time.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to kick off with why you got into teaching. We're going to talk a little bit about what makes our programs unique, a little bit about personal practice, and some things we've done in STU that works, and some things that we've done maybe hasn't worked. So, David, why'd you get into
Start
teaching?
on that end.
Started this end.
Yeah.
That's fair. It's kind of like a, what is it, a fantasy draft?
That's right.
Rebound order. All right, why'd you get into teaching?
I got into teaching accidentally. I had no intention of ever teaching. I was in practice for a while, and I learned, Henry and I were just talking about this, so sorry, Henry, you're going to hear all this again. I was in practice for a while in Knoxville, Tennessee, Baltimore, Maryland, and I was learning a lot, but it was not fun, and I remember school being fun. Architecture school at Tennessee in undergrad was the greatest 5 years of my life. I guess those are formative years when you're in school, but it was such a good time. And I applied to grad schools because I was just bored working in firms. I didn't expect to get into grad school. Got into grad school, went to Harvard for a year and a half, went back into practice, had some fun, but then stopped having fun. Got a call from the former dean at Tennessee, who I kept in touch with. She's like, why don't you come down and teach for a year and see how you like it? So I thought, all right, and I left right before 2008, where half the firm got laid off and pretty much shut down. So I've never looked back. It's been fantastic. That's how I've gotten in. How I've stayed in is probably another story.
Valid. Jennifer, what about you?
How do any of us get anywhere?
Totally accidentally.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was also practicing architecture and enjoying it a lot. School and practice can be quite different, but can also be really fun. You have real clients and you really get to see your work get built, and I find that super exciting to see neighborhoods change and know that you have a part of that. And you get to know your city pretty well. So I got to work internationally some, which was really wonderful in kind of developing areas, and I just saw a lot of systemic problems, and I was working on one site with a client, but the next site and the rest of the city was flooding or had some other chronic issue that we could set a precedent for how to try to do it well, but I couldn't really tap into that as much as I wanted as an architect, and it's hard to find a client base for that in developing areas. They just have other things that they're trying to work on. So there wasn't really a market for it. So I just had all this in the back of my mind. So I went to grad school. I wanted to study some of this more. And then after that, I got a call from my boss, the chair of environmental design, Magdalena Garma. Some of you guys might know her. And she asked if I wanted to teach and try it. And it's something I had considered in the past, kind of in the back of my mind, like, oh, I really enjoy school and learning and teaching looks easy. It's not, let me tell you. I've done a lot of things wrong. Hopefully a couple things right. And no, I didn't think it looked easy, but I was interested in it, so I came here and gave it a try, and I'm still here. I do miss practice a lot. I would like to do both, but I'm really enjoying teaching.
Well, I also practiced for a while. I was actually the university interior designer for 6 years, and so I selected this. So if you don't like it, you're welcome. But I had the ability to work on lots of different types of projects, just because the university is kind of like a city, in that there's all sorts of arms of things that are happening that you aren't even aware of. So I worked on new construction, whole building renovations, tiny renovations. I got called to the vet school once, and they just said they needed some shelves. I was like, okay, I can get some shelves. So I showed up where they told me to show up, got out of my university vehicle, and was like assaulted by a terrible smell from a dumpster. Found out that's where they put the dead bodies. Went through the door into a room where they cut up the dead bodies. And then they took me to the freezer where they store the dead bodies. And so they wanted me to design shelves where the blood would not pool. So had a lot of really neat experiences.
Where do you source something like that?
Do what?
Where do you source something like that?
Where do you store it?
No, source it like, I don't know which website to go to get it.
Oh, it's called
Not-
Burroughs.
Okay.
And then I worked on Mel. And so, the range of stuff was really neat. And I like to joke that I crammed a 20-year career into 6 years because I worked on over 500 projects and I loved it. But it just got to be too much. And so I was starting to crack because they just kept giving me more and more projects. And that's when my retired boss, I have a new department chair, but she approached me at a board meeting and said, do you want to adjunct teach the interior materials and components class? No, teaching is not anything that I'm interested in. But then they really didn't have anybody, and so I'm a very soft heart, and so it's like, okay, I'll do you a favor. And then I have not taught since. So adjuncted for 3 years. A lecture position came open, I applied for it as I was in that cracking moment. Got the job, was a lecturer for 2 years, and now I'm tenure track. So it's worked out. Yeah, and I love it. It's really hard.
It is hard.
But I really love it.
Kelly.
My background's in publication design. I was working for a publication house doing books and magazines. And teaching was something I'd never thought about. I was one of those kids in school, I couldn't wait to get out of school and practice. I wanted to practice. The thought of design, creating things, seeing them come to fruition was just very exciting to me, and to be independent. So I was working at this publishing house, and one of my colleagues came up to me one day and he said, have you ever thought about teaching? I said, no. He said, well, you should. And I said, why? Why should I do it? He goes, you train every junior designer that comes in. It actually evolved into my job. I go seek them out. Do you need help? That's teaching them.
Yeah.
You need help color, picking, whatever. And so it's something he kind of set the seed. And then I was working in Birmingham at the time. And Sanford needed a full-time teacher. Their teacher just quit 2 weeks before school started, and he ran their program. And so the chair of that department contacted me through this friend who came back to me again. And so he literally met me in the lobby, went like this through my portfolio and said, when can you start? And I freaked out. So I essentially worked 7 to 3, get off work, eat something, and I go teach maybe 4 to 9 or 5, and I just teach their classes, and I loved it. I really enjoyed it. So then they approached me about joining them full-time, and I did it, which I look back, I just can't believe I did that. I just quit this job and went into this. And at one point, I was the only teacher for about 90 majors. And I was visiting professor for 12 years. I ran their program, which I didn't understand tenure track. I came from professional, here's your job. It's like, this is my job, I did it. I didn't understand the security of it. So long story short, then I decided to get my master's. So Syracuse had an MFA program in illustration, because I knew I had design. I'm also a painter, and very fine art mindset. And so I wanted to combine the two. And I actually got some good advice that said, if you do illustration, then in a small program, you teach everything, which is essentially what I've been able to do. I teach illustration, drawing, painting, design, whatever. Jack of all trades, specialist in nothing, I guess. So anyway, so I did that for 12 years, and then I quit thinking I was going into illustration full-time, and then Auburn called. And I came here as an adjunct, and then position opened, and I was hired.
What year did you come on?
2000. So this is my 33rd year of teaching.
Wow.
Ooh.
Yeah, I'm the
Yeah.
oldie. I should be on the oldie. Go ahead.
So, let's see. So I started in practice as well. I wanted to be an architect all my life. Went to architecture school and practiced between undergrad and grad. And then in grad school, really, I went to the school I went to was, I chose it so that I could do a dual degree between architecture and landscape. I grew up in a plant nursery, so I kind of loved landscape from a distance. Didn't want to go back to anything that resembled a nursery setting. And then in grad school, just totally fell in love with landscape architecture. Could not imagine going back to architecture. Then practiced for several years for a firm called Dirt Studio. Really love Dirt. Dirt is, Julie Bardman founded Dirt, and she modeled for me this relationship between practice and academia, where you have a legitimate practice and a legitimate academic presence, right? And so I saw Warren Bird do that, I saw W.G. Clark do that. All my favorite instructors had this practice that you could see them experimenting, doing things on the side. Sometimes it was more than the side, it kind of drove things, and sometimes it was less, right? And it kind of balanced out. And so my wife and I have 3 little munchkins that we wanted to get them closer to our family, so we started looking for ways to get further south. Our families are in Georgia. So started looking at positions, and I approached Auburn. They had a position open, and I was just really frank. I said, would you be willing to allow me to have a practice and teach, because I'm not interested in just teaching. And they have a really good lineage of that kind of, with Rural Studio. I don't know about the other schools, but in APLA, it's encouraged, you know. And so I find myself incredibly lucky to be able to have a legit practice and teach in a way that I hope kind of feeds off each other. So that's what got me. I was really seeking out that kind of relationship, not seeking out, you know, if they would have said no, I wouldn't have gotten into teaching. I'm not interested in just teaching. I'm interested in practice first and then build teaching up, you know. So it's kind of where I'm at.
That segue is really good to our second question, but I feel kind of obligated to, like, where my start come from. So I did Auburn Masters, and I got to do study abroad and like, teach a part of that. It's like, oh, this is pretty fun. And like having a really strong athletics background, it became the team that I didn't have in college. And so I graduated, was doing my own kind of private practice, not making a lot of money. It was like 2009 when I graduated, and so there wasn't a lot of opportunity. And so I kind of just got into shoe design, shoe decoration. I just tried all these different avenues, nothing really kicked off. And one of the professors was like, you should try teaching. And I had the degree, but it didn't really kick into my head as something that I could actually do, because I felt like I needed to have more experience. And so I got a call from Louisiana a week into school, already starting, and say, listen, would you like to interview? Who is this? Why are you calling me? And I did, and I kind of liked it, and grew to like, I really liked it. And like having this studio of students became like the team that I can invest in and work with. So let's go back to that segue, which is, what are some of the values that you try to instill in your studio? Like, I'm assuming all of you are in a studio. If not, it's like the best, it's like the class to take, because you get so much development, so much relationship with your peers and with your professor, that those who aren't from a studio background, I don't know what your college looks like. You just go to class and you go home. But this one, you actually get to build and develop. So what are some values you try to give your students in those scenes or in those studios? Just want to throw it to everybody.
Well, I guess I'll start off on that, because it's a really fundamental question. I don't know, I don't try to give them any values, that's their responsibility. I think the challenge in the beginning architecture is to convince students that it's important to have them.
Yeah.
You know, you've got lots of constraints in design. I'm sure we all share this no matter what the disciplines. You know, there's budgets, and environments, and clients, and characters, and codes. I mean, the grid of authority just keeps getting tighter and tighter and tighter. But no matter how conscientious you are about all those constraints, it's never going to give you a design. It might give you direction. But what's going to give you a direction in design is how you evaluate all those constraints and prioritize. And in some of the hardest questions, I think, as a designer, are the ones that are 2 in the morning in studio, where I can't type in the numbers and get a plan. I have to make a decision about a plan, a detail, a material. And a lot of that is going to come from your experience. It's going to come from what you're interested in. And as you get more precise about your interests, they begin to shape what your values are. And then in a way, you have a kind of internal, constantly evaluating manifesto to operate as a designer. And I can't think of anything more important for a young designer to formulate: a philosophy, an agenda, a direction that's your own. So I guess me personally, I'm really careful not to dictate the values, but spend a lot of time talking about why you should have them. When we look at a precedent, talk about the architect, where they came from, how they made decisions. Because ultimately, I think for all of us, we're teaching students how to make decisions. Yeah. I just happen to be teaching them how to make decisions about architecture. And my colleagues, we all have different venues, right? But fundamentally, I think it's the same struggle. I would argue, maybe not.
Love it. What else?
I try to ingrain a lot of reality into my projects because, you know, I come from bloody shelves as
Bloody.
but I mean, as an interior designer, you are called to do a lot of things that you are not prepared by school to do. And so being able to build your tool belt so that you can pull out the tools that you need for whatever the job is, I think that's important. I think that the values forms that foundational component, but I teach a 3rd-year commercial design studio, so we're designing workspace environments. And so having the students really immerse themselves in the abstract of it, but also the reality of it, where they are in the place of the designer, but they also have to get into the head of the client and figure out, you know, if you had to work in this place 40 hours a week, is this the way that you would want it to be designed? Are you designing for the whole self, the wellness component, as well as the functionality? It's not just cubicles. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think my students, you can ask several of them here, they probably get tired of hearing it, but I always start off my class saying the responsibility of the education you get is yours. To me, you can go to a top school and get an average education. You go to a pretty good school and you can dig in and you can get a great education. And I think my role as a teacher is to present it, to be there, to show up, and to challenge. But I can't make it happen. But and for me, I want my student to understand what it is that they do well. And I've been in classrooms where I felt like what I've done has been completely shredded, but that's good. But I found that in my education, I needed to understand what I did well, too. So I usually start with what they're doing well, and then we break down from there. Because then it isn't me solving the thing, it's me saying, here's structurally what you've done, this is what you're looking at, what are you thinking? And I ask a lot of questions, which on my evals is apparently very frustrating. But I'm also trying to teach them questions to ask themselves. So when they get out, they know how to break the thing down. It's not, well, Professor Bryant told me to move it here. It's like, what would she ask me? You know what I mean? And so in that challenge, and it's really exhausting to teach that way. It's easier to go just move it there to work. Right, but you can't. So it's really trying to get them to understand and do that. And of course, it's different I teach at all levels, so it's different from freshman level even now that I've recently gone into all the way up to senior. And I think curiosity. I think as long as we're curious, then you are asking the right questions. You are instilling good value. The curiosity isn't what does this do to fulfill me? It's like, well, how do I find something that fulfills me, as well as how do I find a way to meet what my client's telling me and bring them along for the ride, and we end up with something better and actually hear them and make the project better, not be complaining that their suggestions derailed me, you know.
That makes grading so difficult. Yes, contractually, I have to give you a grade, but a grade has nothing to do with your development as a designer,
Right.
I can't measure your curiosity, and I can't measure or evaluate your perseverance. But we all know that's part of design phase.
But I think it shows up in the end product.
Yeah.
Inevitably, the student that's most curious is the student that ends up with a better product
they
for
kept trying.
themselves. And I think one thing that I do that's too exhausting for me is I really do try to think about each student. You know, I'm asking them questions, I'm trying to go, what are you doing, why are you doing this? Well, let's talk about that, let's think about that. So when I'm sitting there grading, and this frustrates my students, somebody may make an A, the rest of the class is looking at that going, that should be a B, but for that kid, I know it's an A right then.
Yeah.
And it'll go back to a B on the next one, but to me, it's me saying, you can do this. Or the student that's making Bs when they feel like they're making As, but to me, I'm saying, that's a B for you, let's go further.
Yeah.
And I'll explain it to them, but it doesn't make them happy,
Yeah.
right? It doesn't,
I think curiosity is key, and to me, I love how you described the individuality of studio, because everybody's motivated in completely different ways, and so I think one of the critical things is trying to figure out what motivates this student, what are their values, and I do think it's our role to challenge values, not to oppress our values on someone else or whatever, but I do think it's, there's so many students that come into our program that have a set of values that are loosely assembled and haven't been critically evaluated in the discipline of landscape architecture. So yeah, maybe the values, if you separate it and say, well, I want to be a good person, great, what does that mean for landscape architecture? Or, you know, there's so many vague values that trying, you know, how do you try to find that motivation? Where's your value? How does that then get redirected to become a curiosity or an agenda? I think finding students' design agenda, I think is the most difficult thing in the world, but one of the best results if you can find it. You know, it's like really, really tapping into the conversation.
and I think value too lends to not being burnt out in 5 years. To understand what your motivation is behind what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Yeah. Where your occupation becomes a passion.
But
That's-
you have balance at the same time.
Yeah. The competition in design is always going to be there. I think everyone wants to have that creative endeavor, to be known as the think tank person. But there's a lot of hustle behind it. So if it's something you're just doing because like you feel like your family's like, my dad or my mom was a design professional and I'm just doing it, probably a terrible idea.
It's too hard.
Find something like that makes your heart come alive and do that thing, regardless of what it is. And it's difficult for me to tell seniors or like third-year students that, but they're going to be much better in the long run. They can follow something they truly enjoy than hanging around the studio. It's a great environment, but
But
tough.
that's the fatal flaw of our educational system, is you don't get to figure out whether you like it until you've done it for 3 years, and by then, like, oh, shit, I'm vested in this. Am I going to throw away 3 years of college and change directions? So, I mean, it's like, we're just set up to fail.
Yeah.
So, I don't know about you all, I don't know whether or not I enjoy what I was doing in school, or I just convinced myself through the psychology of previous investment, like, yeah, this is good, I've done it for 4 years. I don't like sleep. It's awesome. So to this day, I mean, I still look back and like, I don't know whether I made a conscious decision to go to architecture school, or, you know, that's just what I chose and I found out it was interesting. Maybe I could have done something else. So, I mean, you said a term, I don't know if we're changing the subject, you know, passion. I also wonder whether, and creativity, like I think those are good values depending on the person, but sometimes one can be overly passionate and not be dispassionate enough to kind of evaluate things. Sometimes if we're too focused on our students to be passionate about their work, the work becomes just so precious that, you know, we can't challenge it. And, you know, what was the other word? Creativity. I don't know, sometimes I think the creative culture, like everybody should be creative, is a bit overrated. You know, maybe creativity is an interesting value to set up something else that's more important, like being rigorous about your creativity. Deciding, like, I've created something, but does the world need it? What kind of value does this add to the world? So the notion of creating for the sake of creating and fostering the creative mind, I think it has to be tempered with some other restraints. But that's something that I think gets teased out in, you know, the interrogation and discussion. Because I know what my horrible constraints are and why I'm impotent as a designer because I'm questioning too much, but I don't want my students to have that. So they kind of have to figure out their relationship to creativity, to passion, to values, and as David said, you know, that comes to some sort of agenda that they can use as a tool. And maybe that's, I don't know, we never really defined what values were, but I would argue that values are tools that allow you to operate intentionally and with some confidence, like, I made a good decision, I can sleep at night.
Yeah.
Conviction.
I want to build, I mean, I think your kind of suspicion of the word creativity, I get on board with that a lot. And I think
Yeah.
too many people define creativity as it's not rational, so it must be creative,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And there's so much good design that's just rational, you know? And if you have to just lean on like, well, I can't find a reason, so then it must be creative, then I think that's a pretty superficial
Yeah.
support. And so I think maybe our understanding of what creative is probably not there, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And so but I love the way you're talking about, because so many people are like, oh, you're in the creative fields, and
It must be so fun.
I kind of,
Sounds like a playground.
And you should be paid less because it's fun.
Right.
See, I think about design education as problem-solving education.
That's exactly what
Yeah,
us too.
because I've had students that go through graphic design, they're excellent graphic designers, but they get out and they're missing the human element. I'm like, but then they feel like they failed because you're doing something else. I'm like, no, you've been trained to be a problem solver. You carry a
Exactly.
skill set forward
Mhm.
and a mindset in the way you approach whatever problems life brings you. You're a problem solver. So I think that's part of that curiosity. How do I approach something? How do I look at things? How do I live my life? It's all buttoned up together.
I want to jump in because I want to hear your thoughts about this. So we, in landscape, this problem-solving thing comes up a lot, and students come in with that agenda, like, climate change, we need to fix it, and we're going to solve the problem. And we're trying to shift and pivot a bit away from, I think we do solve problems, but I think more than that, I think we try to find opportunities that may not. I think what we're discovering in landscape architecture, and there's probably more in landscape architecture because of this whole climate change question, is that how can you design when the problem is so complicated that you can't solve it individually? Like, you might contribute a bit, but if your value of your project is based on whether you solved a problem, you're going to be disappointed a lot.
Oh, yeah, I
Right?
think it's a component.
So this
Yeah.
kind of,
I agree, yeah.
So we actually don't have studio, which is interesting, in environmental design. So that, I've been quiet for a little bit, I'm just listening, learning from all of you. So I started a blended model where before projects due, we cancel class and I just open up my schedule and we have desk crits. So I'll have group meetings and we'll do art individually, and we'll do like 20-minute desk crits after they've gone through an iterative process.
wow.
And I think the thing
How many
I really,
hours does that take?
it takes a long time. Yeah, it takes away from my research,
That's a
which is
huge
a problem.
investment.
Yeah.
It's a big problem. But I find it successful, and then I think, it's never gonna replace studio, but I think it's puts in some seeds that need to be there for more one-on-one interaction. I think I wanted to say this earlier, I'll come back around. I think passion is so necessary because we're up against a lot. There are some really critical things that I think we're trying to solve or adapt to or mitigate, or these wicked problems. And I think being clear that they're wicked problems and they're going to change and you can't solve for all of them, but we can reduce our negative impact and try to increase opportunities for populations that are going to be using these spaces is something I'm trying to communicate more. And sometimes I fall in that own trap of just saying it wrong and believing that I have to be perfect. And I think it's ingrained in me just as an architect, as a perfectionist, as trying to seek excellence, but realize, the things we are trying to solve are really complicated, and even in great teams, mistakes will be made, but hopefully the benefit outweighs that, and over time, we're moving in a better direction with our built environment. But the thing about passion is, it's a lot of work. It is, to iterate and to know that my first option is not going to be the best one, and I just need to keep researching and kind of try new strategies and throw spaghetti on a wall and see how that works. Talk to people, get more feedback, do observational research, site analysis. I mean, all the things. Where is the sun? Where, what kind of vegetation? It's a lot. And you don't get paid for all those hours. In practice, I mean, we all know you just don't. There's some late hours. So the passion does have to come in, but you really do have to separate yourself from your work. Because it's not about you. It is about creating a better environment for your client, for the stakeholders, for yourself as well, but you're just a small piece in a larger thing that is happening. And as much as students can do that, I think it helps when we do have to do critique after we call out the good things that they're doing, because that's valuable and a good thing to remember. But when we do call out, okay, but these are the problem areas, or the areas I think that might be of gaps in your kind of thinking, I think that passion, it just really has to be there. And we're against, I just don't know if there's a huge funding base for a lot of the things that we're trying to do. And if you go to the city planning meetings, as you try to work on your house, there's just a lack of understanding to a general population of what designers do. It is fun. And so we're up, I'm not trying to say, woe is me, I don't want that perspective at all, but there is some challenges there, barriers, I think, to our work. And I think in time it'll change. I think people understand design thinking and systems thinking, and understand that, we need different disciplines of designers at the table. But I don't know if that's always been there. I'm not fully sure.
You touched on a
All
really
the
good
thoughts.
point about this, how practice and studio are always kind of one and the same. So a lot of our contracts are structured in a way that we have to produce research, but it's not as clear cut as maybe a history major or a psychology professor. So a lot of what we do is practice based. So I want to open up a little dialogue about what type of practice do you do and how does that fold into your classroom?
I mean, I'll go for that first because it comes from the statement about design as problem solving.
Yeah.
And in terms of passion, I think my problem with it is mainly semantic. And I also think when we talk about wicked problems.
Just too much emotion.
Yeah. There's so many horrible things that humans have to do every day. I don't know, somebody is in a ditch right now doing something disgusting and dangerous that's knocking years off their life, so I can check my email. So but are they passionate about that? I mean, I don't know. It's I got to feed my family. I mean, there's a lot of things that we have to do that are jobs. And if we're not passionate about it, if we spend too much time encouraging you have to love what you do and be passionate about it, then when the passion's not there, it's hard to be productive. So I think that for some people, passion is productive. For other people, it's I would say half my students don't really care about architecture. They want a good job. But they don't really care about architecture. But anyways, that's another topic. I think it's a really good one to have, though. But in terms of practice, I think that as designers, the goal is to solve problems too, but I would argue that design creates more problems than it solves. Every problem that we're trying to solve, like climate change, we designed that. Somebody before us designed something that created that problem. It's a technological problem that a previous culture, previous values made a decision about. So every building I build, I create problems. I have removed land that would have soaked in water. I have cast a shadow on my neighbor's garden. I have contributed to the carbon footprint. It's my only option is if I really don't want to solve problems is to I don't know, go in the forest, build a cabin, take all my clothes off, quit checking my internet. I mean, at a certain point, you have to decide whether you're going to be a designer or a saint.
Why
Because
don't
you
you go
can't be
naked
both.
just then? I don't know how that contributes.
Because my clothes were produced in a sweatshop, right? So I have to shed these jeans. But I'm just saying, at a certain point, it's it's hard for me to have faith in design as a problem-solving endeavor when every single example of design, even design that I think is good for me, is problematic for some other aspect of culture. So in our practice, which as you can imagine doesn't build much, we have a lot of paralyzing discussions about the amount of harm our decisions do. And then at some point, after we've had enough drinks, we decide that, all right, maybe we can make something. So the nice thing about teaching, the relationship of teaching and practice for me, is that I can refuse to do things. And in practice, I couldn't refuse to do things because money had to be made, people had to be paid, which is good.
It's true.
But the nice thing, the privilege of being an academic that can also practice is that I don't have to do any jobs to make money. I mean, wouldn't it be nice? But I don't have to, so they can be almost purely intellectual pursuits.
Yeah.
And my colleagues that I work with, my buddy Nate in Chicago teaches at DePaul in graphic design. My buddy Brian is a firearms designer in Huntsville for Remington.
Yeah.
So he has a lot to contribute. We have a really interesting dialogue and use our firm of structures as a vehicle to kind of tackle these issues.
Yeah.
One of the things, structures is not a term we came up with. All these thoughts come from this essay by this guy, Willem Flusser. And he wrote this article called Design to the Removal of Obstacles. Basically, the premise is when you design, you create an obstacle that some other design is going to have to design their way around. Much more eloquent about it than me, but if anybody's interested, it's 3 pages of philosophical text that completely changed my view on design. Not in a positive way, as you can see. But cynicism, I think, is productive.
Yeah.
So negativity can be productive. Criticism can be productive. I'm not optimistic about design at all. But I don't tell this to first-year students. Who's next?
How do you?
Oh, unfortunately. Yeah. it's
So can
rough.
you guys have practice count for your research stuff?
I'm
If
learning
it
that
gets
yes,
recognized
you can.
in some way.
As long as it's peer reviewed.
Yeah.
And
Okay,
some-
so
in some-
reviewed.
in
Creative
some realm.
scholarship and journal articles and stuff?
Yeah.
Okay,
Awards programs.
Yeah.
yeah.
Our research is written, our document is very
Uh-huh.
loose.
Yeah.
So you can do everything from conferences and papers and that kind of thing. You could
Mhm.
do a form of outreach if you want it.
Mhm.
You can practice design, and we even have a fine art component in
Wow.
ours.
I like your document.
Well, you have to realize we have illustrators sitting there.
Yeah.
And we have fine art folks that teach drawing and paintings and things for our majors, so.
Okay.
Or more of that
Yeah.
mindset, so they need to be able to, you want them practicing in those
Yeah.
fields, so we try to build that flexibility. We're kind of the odd one in the college,
Yeah.
but we fought for it,
Yeah.
because we knew it was important to the curriculum.
Mhm.
I feel like I dropped a negativity bomb. But I want to say that at the end of the day, you're entirely right about solving problems. I just think we have to, it's like, in Fight Club, that scene where you have to hit rock bottom before you can move forward, like you have to lose faith in absolutely everything. I feel like to tackle some of these problems, it's almost like you have to break it all down to first principles. Like the absolute deepest, darkest place where we can't do anything but make a pretty building. And then you have to just do what you can. Like you have more realistic expectations than my third-year project's going to solve climate change. Probably not. But if you have more realistic expectations about what's solvable through incremental steps, these problems that seem insurmountable can be attacked more methodically.
Well, and I think when you look at different disciplines, you're looking at different kind of problems too.
Definitely.
I mean, I'm not
Yeah.
putting a shadow over my neighbor's garden, I'm designing a poster or a book, and, books are dying and everybody's going digital, and you're still saying, no, there's something very appropriate about holding the physicality of this object in your lap, and you're looking at it, and the content, how that enhances it.
Yeah.
It might end up on a recycling bin. I don't really, maybe I don't take myself seriously enough about design. I approach what I do, I want to do it well. I want to feel like I've solved it. I want my client to be a part of it. I agree that in teaching that I now have the ability to choose those projects I want, but I've never really been a rich designer because I'm always driven by the kind of work I can do. I'm not very money driven. So, in fact, every job I've taken a pay cut, so don't listen to me on the scripts. Because I'm always looking at what's the project and what am I interested in, and is there a skill set there I can gain that maybe I don't have that I'm interested, I want to do. So I think that goes back to values and motivations and where people are rooted in things, and those are all okay. I'm glad I don't have to think about some of the things that you do. I don't know where I'd be on that, you know, Matt,
On the
to be
floor
quite
with
honest.
him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think I'm not diminishing graphic design. I think it's a very rich field. I loved it. I went to school to be a fine artist. I found design and I went into design and double majored. But I think it's just, comes down to personality and kind of where you're at. When I'm talking about problem solving, it's, well, what is this in front of me, and trying to be objective about it rather than I'm forcing it into this thing. It's like, no, what is it, and what is it saying to me, and how do I break that down, and what are the questions I ask to get at that? And can I be objective enough with it to go, this is really a bad route, let's go this way. You know what I mean?
It's also difficult to get paid for that. I try to explain to new
Right.
clients, like, we're gonna go down all these roads. The majority of them aren't bad. But if I'm walking on the Appalachian Trail, I think, listen, I've been down that path, that's not a good one. Don't do that. And these are the reasons when
Right.
you're defending your design. But if you do that to someone on a trail, they're very thankful, monetarily or not. But it's difficult in a very consumer society when I say, hey, I spent all this time in what I think we would call like non-billable design hours,
Yeah.
exploring this. That way I'm a utility to you. And that's kind of where the hours come from. I can't just put an equation in and then all of a sudden, here's your solution. It's
Right.
the
I
grinding
think
interrogation.
that's really critical. It's hard to teach as well, of like, most people think a good designer has a good design and they develop a good design.
Yeah.
But in reality, a good designer can weed through 16 not so good designs
Right.
and find the 17th one, right? And so many of our students just think it's the first one and the first two, and a good designer just makes that good.
Yeah.
And I think the way you described it so well, like, oh my gosh, there's so many things that you have to work through to get to find that good design.
Yeah.
You're not just creative or brilliant and you
Or
just
lucky.
or lucky and you just like have to document the first thing you come up with, and then you just make that great. Like it's work, and it's putting the time in to just sift through the other. You know, I think that's huge, and I'd love to hear how you guys encourage students to go through those steps. So like, how do you get past the first pieces that aren't great, right? How do you do that?
Or when it is the great one, but you're willing to go further in order to understand why it's the great one.
Yeah.
As much as, so I think, I would love to hear your thoughts on this too, is thinking back in my undergrad education, no critique of it, but I think there were these, as an architecture student, there were these star-architects, and, Frank Lloyd Wright came up with Falling Water, like, on the car ride on the way there, and then it was basically the same thing. And, I think we had these ideas in our mind that, well, that's what brilliance is then. Exactly the opposite of what we're saying is the process of a good designer. So I think it really took me a while in practice, watching, and some in school, those above me and mentors. I mean, David Hill, you were even one of my mentors in my thesis, of doing the process and seeing them not make mistakes, but wrestle with it and be like, oh, this is really it. So I think in classroom, I have to swallow my pride and really accept that I'm not the expert in all things, and I'm gonna draw on the board or the whiteboard, and I'm just gonna draw out some ideas. Some of this is gonna be crap.
Yeah.
Great friends.
And I really have to swallow my pride, because it's like, I don't know how this is gonna go. I don't know the answer, but I really wanna show students that there's a process. We don't start off as the experts, and we're all learning together, and I might end up looking silly, or that never really happens. We end up working towards something that is valuable. And so I try to keep that, whatever I got in practice and even in school, as I'm up there.
Well,
I don't know if it works. Can ask my students.
Well, one thing I'd add, because when I say in asking good questions, to me, one of the most valuable questions is, what if I do what? And I say it in my classes all the time. And I say it to myself, what if I do what? Because so many times as a designer, it's like, okay, I've got a deadline, I've got to do this, da-da-da-da-da. but when I can actually stop and pull back and say, but what if I do what? And then try those things, and then the rabbit hole begins, right? And then you come back and you're going back to it. A lot of times it enriches the idea. And even getting beyond what's intuitive to me as a designer and what is I've actually learned and know to be truth. You know, when like this principle would work here, as opposed to that just feels right. Why does it feel right? Those are the questions I'm meaning and inferring to. It's that dialogue of getting at when is that, the big question, when is it done?
Yeah.
Those things.
But that's a good balance you're pointing to about, you know, there's certain principles that determine correctness depending on our discipline. But there's also stuff that just feels right or wrong. And that stuff I think is, I mean, it's fuzzy, I'm sure, for us as professionals. But I'm sure it's really fuzzy for students too, because everything's new, right? It's like foreign language class, the stuff you have to deal with. So it's hard to make decisions when you don't have all the principles and the tools yet. But on day one in design studios, we're asking students to make decisions. So I think, David, your question about how do you get past the first idea, you know, our colleague Bazad would say, well, every student needs to learn how to kill their firstborn. He's very dark about it. It's like, whatever your first idea is, you shall slaughter it, burn it, and move on to the second one, because it's probably crap. But then again, it's challenging. I've had really good students before where their first idea is pretty awesome. But I don't want to set the example of immediate brilliance, so we usually through, I think as you're saying, like there's some interrogation about, did they know it? You know? And if they know it, if they can explain and rationalize why they've made the decisions they've made, then the other thing that one can do, which is the opposite of iteration, is refinement, which is another skill they need to learn. It's like you have to get them to iterate enough to make sure they've teased out all the possibilities. Or maybe they have a great idea, but you know when you're presenting to clients, sometimes you have to show enough flawed things to convince them that one thing is the right thing. It's like you have to draw the bad designs to set up the argument for the good design. At that point, you can get to a design that maybe has enough legs to begin refining. So I think it could be bad either way. You know, you start refining too early, it's problematic because you haven't fully explored possibility. If you start refining too late, then you have something that's completely half-baked, not well represented, not well worked out. So that's always a tough balance, and I'm sure it's, as you say, situational. Like you want to say on week 3 we refine, but some students are ready to refine on week 1.5, and some might be ready to refine at week 5. That's another huge challenge, is to deal with them all individually.
How big are y'all's studios? How big are your studios or your classes?
We have about 15. If you go to freshman, it's 18.
17 right now in one group and 10 in the other.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the classes I try to make into studios, it's like 30. Yeah.
Wow.
Times 20-minute desk crits, girl.
Like a snack bar or something.
Yeah.
You're gonna be out of energy by the time you're done.
Yeah, first year in the summer is 30. Most of the other studios are, 12 to 20. But don't you find sometimes at 30, you just have to figure out what are their common struggles and attack those. It's so difficult to get individual with that many students in the time that you have.
See, I need to work on that. I think I still try.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's because you care. That's good. That's
Yeah, but you gotta
Yeah.
have self-preservation.
That
Yeah,
passion's gonna
right.
kill you.
passion.
It will kill you.
No,
Yeah.
we have to have passion. I just don't want to teach it.
I make a y'all sheet where I start seeing the same things over and over again, and
Yeah.
I'll start making a sheet that's like, y'all, look at this, and then I post it,
Yeah.
and it saves a lot of time. It's good, yeah.
So what about y'all? What questions do y'all have? I've got one more in the chamber in terms of questions, but this is really for y'all, so what do y'all think?
In terms of like creativity and practicality, where do you guys like balance that in a studio or classroom to your students? If that makes sense. Like when are you too creative and when are you being too practical?
Can I jump in and say I don't think it's a binary?
Okay.
Yeah.
Like we often say, are you being creative or being practical? I think it gets back to our definition of creativity often is the opposite of rational or the opposite of practical, to use your term. But I think that undermines the power of creativity because some of the best work is working within constraints within budget, within schedule. So I think we falsely set up that binary and we push them to the edges when they could very easily be overlapping terms and qualities.
Well,
That's-
I think you're entirely right, but I guess it's a question, how would you define creativity versus practice? Because I think there's a question that it's really important, but
It's more of like creativity is like abstract conceptualization, and then practicality would be like further down the road. When you think of like the internals and like engineering.
okay, does it work, so.
Yeah, I think having a strong party, so I'm gonna talk in architecture language, that's what I know.
Party.
Really pigeonholed myself into architecture. I mean, you can walk into a space and if it has a wonderful party, I mean, the experience of that spatially is really wonderful and just enjoyable as a human. We could talk about beauty, we could talk about material, we could talk about all sorts of environmental, even scientific things, but it's just a really wonderful experience. And I really value having a strong party as you start your, as you work through your design process and then begin to move into refinement, I guess. So as you move into refinement or practicality, like how do you begin to make footings and what kind of structure are we using and begin to answer those questions. How's the roof system working and the span here? What's the facade going to be made of? What materials? What is your R value through the wall system? I think there's a design language that needs to thread throughout all of that. And the values you set up at the beginning or the constraints you had at the beginning still are there, and you're still kind of going back to a lot of those as you make decisions about materials and a wall assembly. Whether that's program things that you receive from the client or it's environmental conditions, where are you in like latitude? How cold is it? How hot is it? And then do you just want the core tin to kind of over time drip onto the concrete and leave this residue? That's, I don't know. So I don't know if I answered that.
Can I try that again? too,
Yeah.
Captain? I think really just to build up. So I think when I describe trying to avoid the binary, what I hear you describing when you say practicality is really an evaluation criteria, right? So like these are where I hit the marks of is it going to last long or whatever. And I think what's all too often we think that is engineering and that's right. And then creativity is more like our emotions, how we feel. If everything else is ignored, what do I want to do here, right? And I think if we just acknowledge that evaluation criteria is also a design process, and you can manipulate that, right? So, I think you could then start taking like, why do I want to do this, and start interrogating it, and what is the value, and how do I evaluate it? I think that they can become much more in line, and you don't have to put them against each other. That's what I was trying to describe. I think that's what I hear you talking about it. Yeah, you're talking about design, and the way you're talking about a party is valuable. There's some intuitive part about that, but you can start articulating that intuition a bit. And then there's also some external forces, like the client likes Corten, right? And so,
Or pink.
or pink, right? And so I just encourage you to try to interrogate your own intuitive questions, but let them be legitimate and stand right beside your questions about durability or something else.
Practicality,
This
yeah.
practicality, right? And so that they both have a voice and are somewhat, you can start making rational decisions on which one should have a greater voice. Right? Because sometimes you could say, I can deal with that problem through paint. I can paint it, or whatever,
And I think you're getting at a really important question
That's true.
about, maybe I would say like the theoretical and the practical. Like you can be really creative, like plumber in my house is crazy creative in routing cement stacks. He didn't have any sort of deep theory about it. He wasn't like going to take a picture and put it on his Instagram. He didn't think of himself as an artist. Like he self-actualized himself through PVC. He just like got the poop stink out in a way that worked. And it was really creative, but it was all towards practical aims. And I think if I'm maybe reading into your question a bit too much, I mean, we're all in school, and unless you're actually producing something, you know, in the architectural world of academia, we're not making buildings most of the time. We're making representations of buildings. We're making theories of possible buildings. And at that point, I think that's where your question's really key. Like when you know that I'm a second-year student, I'm imagining an idea for a building in downtown Chicago, how much of my imagination should be limited by the practical when this project will only live on a piece of paper or in a rendering or in a model? And I think that's a great struggle to deal with, because you don't want to corrupt theoretical exploration with too much practicality, but you don't want to have a theoretical exploration without any notion of how it could be applied. Maybe. I think when you use the term binary, I found it to be really productive to say, to find analogous terms, put them in opposition, and put your decision maker on a slider.
Yep.
You know, between this and that. And sometimes between this and that, your this and that might be different than my this and that. You know, theoretical, practical, contextual, unique. How much of me should I put into it? How much of the client should I put into it? Like Hans Jorg, one of our recent lecturers, the me-we ratio. Like every design is a little bit of me, obviously, because I'm making it, but I'm a flawed human being, and I need to know what those flaws are, so I need to know myself. And then what I'm making, I'm throwing into the world to serve others, so I have to check my desires for the good of making a greater contribution. But again, that's a slider, and that's a struggle. And those setting up generalizations and oppositional terms and figuring out where you sit on that line, I think is good. And then you decide what's good to you. Personally, I think good design is stuff that's balanced in that way. It's balanced in its sense of being conservative yet challenging, you know, very aesthetic yet contributory. You can tell who designed it, but maybe you're a little confused, you know, because it's so contextual in its place. But you know, you're going to decide something differently, probably. I think you're all decide something differently on that scale.
That guy had a question first.
Hi. So I was thinking that 100 years ago, I think Bauhaus was employing the paradigm of form follows function. And I'm curious, in each of your own biases, you could describe what you believe the paradigm of design for 2020.
Do we all agree, though, that form follows function is a myth?
Yes, well, I do.
Is that fair?
Do we
You would
agree
say
what
that?
form follows
That was
function?
entirely.
Is a myth.
Or is it
Oh.
possible for a form truly to be a product of its function?
A duck?
A duck? Yeah, but I'm not
Decoration.
God. I'm not creating. Oh, you mean in terms of the decorated? Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Ah,
Is that what we're
Venturi.
talking about?
We could. Oh, I won't go there.
Let's
Never
not.
mind.
That's a big question.
Yeah.
I'm-
Sorry, I haven't lived
Yeah.
long enough to.
Yeah.
So what's
I
our
don't think I know.
cause today? Like, what's our movement? Is that what you're asking?
Sure.
I'm not taking tackle on that one first.
Oh, come on. I won't give it a try, because we all know how to be wrong, right?
That's true.
So
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we're
in
good at that.
I'll model wrongness right here. I feel like a couple of things are really big right now. One is there's this huge inclusivity that's happening across so many cultures that we're agreeing on, and you can see it. We talked about it in the studio yesterday with how Me Too is changing form, right? And how structural systems are changing as a result of greater value on diverse opinions. So I think that's going to have an impact on our form-making process. I don't know how, but I do think that our value, you know, you can look back at modernism, Bauhaus movement, where form was fairly, like there were some very clear structures that were valued, and there were a lot of stuff that was devalued, right? And there was a hierarchy there that I think is getting eroded from the bottom right now, which is pretty exciting and scary. And how do you design and teach in that atmosphere?
I wasn't at the this was a lecture. I wasn't able to attend. I had a class. I'm a student. Thank you guys. again. Can you unpack that a little bit, how social change is impacting, like what they were saying about how the social impact?
It's not that, they weren't saying that, we were talking about it in studio, about just how form, we're looking at form very abstractly right now in our studio class. And we were having a discussion about how modernism viewed order and structural systems, how postmodernism viewed order and structural systems and devalued it even more. And, just looking at the trajectory of symmetry and asymmetry, oversimplifications to 10th degree, right? But still trying to acknowledge that form is some sort of cultural act, and it's both a result of culture and an advancement or kind of challenge to culture. So that's what we're talking about, right?
I wonder, just to be precise relative to your question, and it's an interesting one, not so much does form follow function still exist as a paradigm. I think it still is baggage we carry to be responsible. But what does form follow now? There could be another question like, what's our greatest struggle or movement as designers? But I think that's a more precise one, like what does form follow now? I think to answer that question, we have to say, as designers, it's our job to give form to things, which I also think is interesting. You've all had some like crazy uncle that had an idea. I got this idea but they don't have any idea how to bring that. They don't have any idea how to give form to that idea. Maybe that's what we're supposed to be professionals at. Like human beings, every human being has an idea, and every human being's a designer. Like I'm going to design what I'm going to do today. We just happen to get paid to do it. So maybe it's our job to responsibly give form to things. So today, what does form follow? I think it's tough. Does form follow economics? Does form follow image? Does form even have any substance anymore? Because forms are gone like that. Architecture and landscape architecture start to become such difficult disciplines in that regard, because by the time we've given form to something, it's almost like it's invalid. The conditions have changed. Things are moving so fast, it's hard for slow professions to keep up. I'm curious what you think about this. My colleague Nate up in Chicago is a graphic designer, and he talks a lot about graphic design's medium to be more directly related to the context on the ground, because it can be quicker, information can be produced quicker. And his critique of it, because he still enjoys print. There's something historical about print. Print stays around, you hold it in your hand. He argues that the crisis is that, it's a crisis of a loss of tangibility, that we don't want to hold it anymore. We don't have the bandwidth for more than 280 characters. Like depth is going away in culture. And that becomes a crisis, not just for presenting information, like Twitter, for instance, and debates where I'm going to pick a president based on 6.5 minutes of speech, but also for making things that are culturally valid.
Well, and I think too, graphic design's evolved so much in my lifetime of teaching and just my career, because when I went to school, you did everything by hand, so it was a slower process.
Yeah.
And then computers come in, and you used to have people set your type, and they were experts in that. Now you've got the graphic designer. To me, the graphic designer keeps taking on more and more roles.
Mm-hmm.
Now I have to be the web designer, I have to be the typographer that I used to send out. I have to know all of this software. There's not just 1 or 2 softwares. We're now, I think, up to about 6 softwares that graphic designers have to know. And so you have to be this jack of all trades in this thing. So it's really hard to be a specialist. And they want it all faster, is where I was going with your thing. Because it's like, when I started working, I could take in a job. I would be setting the type for this one. I'd be working on this one. I could multitask on them. Now all those jobs are on my desk, and they sit there until they're out. There's nobody else for it to go to. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think there's that aspect, and then the whole tangible aspect of graphic design. I wonder how much of it really is true, that the tangible of holding these objects really is going away, or are we just being told that? But people still have a desire for the tangible and to be there and to have the contact. So when culturally something like a phone comes in and people are on this and they're walking down the sidewalk and they're lost, they're not paying attention or they're not interacting when that's happening, versus I still want my book. I don't know how much of it is a given and a real shift culturally, and how much of it is we're being told culturally. That's where we're at.
Yeah.
I don't even know if I answered your question all that, but that's something I struggle with in graphic design. It used to be really fun, and you could have time to think and work through it and get there, and now it's like this, and it's that way in our classroom, and it's something, quite honestly, I'm not really a fan of.
Yeah, form
Struggle
follows
with.
speed.
Yeah.
I
There you
don't
go.
Prime now.
To add into the Bauhaus, not an expert, critique anything I say. It's been a while since I've studied Bauhaus. But if that was big part about mass production and even the students mass producing their work and then selling that, which is really amazing. I wonder if today, if like our zeitgeist is somewhere between mass production and then also individuality of our craft, of me being able to enter, me as a person, as a client, being able to enter into mass production and shift a couple things so that it reflects my particular needs, that maybe wasn't as doable when Ames was making, their famous plywood chairs. So I'm wondering if that's more what we're capable of doing based on technology. We can do that with technology now. We can stop somewhere in the middle and make some changes to a model and then produce it for somebody, and it can respond more to your needs or to the site or something like that. Just a guess.
We should also probably kind of position form follows function as a response to something that preceded it, right? Like the Bauhaus were looking at these buildings that were incredibly ornate
Those
and
are
superficially ornate, right? That the structure was not reading through. They had this amazing structure, and then they did all this elegant stuff that was in front of it. So it was a complete, like, wait a minute, Dad's junk is silly, right? And I think we're doing that, like the previous generation is like, wait a minute, they really did pollute a lot of landscape, or they really did, dang, they used a lot of carbon, and they're putting us on this track to use a lot of carbon. So I think a lot of that will come from that kind of like, how are we responding to our previous generation's work? And then I've been around long enough to already hear, I hate it, but I already hear y'all's generation talk about my generation's work. I'm like, that's ridiculous. We're not going to do it like that again, you know? So it's kind of painful to see that.
The obstacle course continues.
Yeah, right.
Well, I think there's this natural place where generations just go, like you're saying, no. But then I think there's also this thing of, well, wait a minute, we still want that.
Yeah.
And so I didn't mean to oversimplify, but it's even like records are popular again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? You know, it's like,
What do you
oh,
guess?
LPs, you have the richest sound and all of this, and you have your big system, and then people are like, no, CDs, and now we're into MP3s and all this stuff. And now people are going all the way back to a record, you know? And even as a graphic designer, you're like, it's really 12 by 12 space to design.
If you get a gatefold.
Right, I don't have this anymore, or even just nothing. It's,
Yeah.
you see what I mean? So I
Yeah,
think,
that's fun.
I think there is that rejection, but I think there's also, sometimes you're reaching back, and I completely agree with the whole Bauhaus thing. It's a reaction to time, and I think you have to look at things contextually.
This has been some really good conversation. Like, we are over time. Thanks for sticking
Yeah,
with
got a
us. Thanks
student
for
waiting on it.
hanging out. We're just going to turn like this cassette over. We'll do this again next semester if there's enough call for it. But thank you all for coming. Thanks for participating.
Yeah, guys, thanks
Yeah,
for
sure.
coming.
Thanks for having us.
Good to see you.
There's plenty of pizza.
Yes.
Let's go
Grab
have
from the warehouse.
seconds.